All right, so I want to touch on this a little bit because I have some input. But on Monday, Dana White dropped an absolute bombshell on the media, the negative media, particularly the negative media that's attacked him and doubted him as he trailblazed through this coronavirus pandemic, making events, keeping his fighters paid, keeping his staff paid, and keeping the UFC above water, and able to survive this horrific pandemic that we're facing. He was a guest on our podcast 2 months ago, a couple months ago, back in October. And not only did he give me and the podcast the absolute biggest rant on the media I've ever heard him launch verbally, he also said that he had something brewing, that he was putting something together to fire back, that he has taken it and taken it and taken it and taken it, and he was going to fire back and have the last laugh, of which we saw what he was talking about finally on Monday. So before I go any further, let's just go back and look at that footage of 2 months ago in October. How bad was the negative publicity, or not publicity, but just the negativity to you? We've seen, our side of it from the outside, but how bad did people bash you for wanting to go forward and do this thing?
It's fucking indescribable. It's indescribable.
I would assume
how fucking bad the negativity was. And you know me, man. I got a little something for these motherfuckers at the end of this year that I've been building and putting together, and I can't fucking wait.
You get a hint? Can we have a little hint? Just something?
I'm gonna let me tell you what. The media had their shot. They had their time and got all their shots in. Mine's coming.
Good. It feels good to do that, right?
This is what I'm all about. This is what I live for.
Yeah.
And there's nothing better than proving these pussies wrong.
Yeah.
I love it.
All right, so there you have it. And if you haven't watched that podcast episode, I would suggest watching it because it is powerful. I want to share some insight on the negative impact the media can make and why the media is not really, at least the negative media is not really your friend like they pretend to be. I was in the UFC for 11 years. I've had to deal with it. So I've had the media throughout my career ask me for the inside information. Who are you fighting? Are you injured? Are you going to make this? All these things that turn into headlines and turn into big stories. And they convince you as fighters, and I guess this message is to fighters out there and people that don't have this knowledge, that you're helping them. You feel good when you give these tips and inside information to the media to help them make their articles and make them happy and hope that they pay it back and make a good article about you and keep you in positive light and boost you as well, which is what should happen. But in reality, the reason they're happy is because they're getting money. They're getting paid. It's a financial thing. And there's always fighters at some point going on record about fighter pay and wanting more money. But this is where it should become easy to see the difference between a company like the UFC and the media outlets who you think are your friends as fighters who are launching your voice and getting you heard, when in reality, they're doing worse to you than the UFC or the organization that you're complaining about is actually doing. And what I mean by that is the UFC signs contracts with fighters. So does every other organization. They sign a 4-fight deal, 5-fight deal, whatever the case, right? They're a business. Their goal is to sign you for a certain amount of money to make you happy. And then they hope during that time, your value goes up. And they can make a little bit of extra money by not having to pay you so much while you have big buys and big draws and big fights before you renegotiate. Of course, if you continue to do so, when you renegotiate, you're going to have a lot of power and leverage to get a better contract, right? But when you sign a contract, it's a contract. It's locked. I mean, there's nothing you should be able to complain about. You sign the contract. Every single fighter goes on Twitter and Instagram and brags about their UFC contract. When they get it, then they win 2 fights, become superstars, and then they complain and say the UFC is screwing them over. In reality, that's what the UFC hopes happens because many times the UFC signs contracts to fighters, 4-fight contracts for a decent amount of money, and they lose because the fighters don't win and they don't become draws, and they just lose the amount of money that they paid them, hoping that they would be big draws. So when the fighters want to come out and argue about fighter pay and the media and do these articles, I understand that. I'm the media. There's media out there. I'm not going to take those fighters in here to complain about stuff. We don't do that in this podcast. We don't have negative vibes. But the media, I understand they're going to do it. That's fine. There's no issue there. But when the media gets behind the fighters and try and take sides and flip the headlines, take things out of context, and make it look like these organizations like the UFC are taking advantage of the fighters, and it's wrong. So many of these journalists have spoken out about how horrific and horrible it is that they're getting taken advantage of and they're not getting the money that they should. Meanwhile, these fighters are getting the exact amount of money that they signed for. They're getting the same amount of money that they shook hands with Dana and the UFC and the matchmakers and the lawyers and agreed to. They just became bigger stars during that contract and decided they wanted more money. That's the only thing that changed. But the media outlets that boost all these articles and get these fighters on their side to tell their story, and they make all this money in advertising and all this money in clickbait headlines and views, and they don't give anything to the fighter. But when the media then goes behind the fighter to try to say that the fighter is getting taken advantage of by the UFC, that's in the last podcast where I said it was very hypocritical. If you're going to do an article and you're going to have somebody complain about something about being taken advantage of, as the media, you should just shut up and let them do the article. Write what they say and stay out of it. But it's very, very common that in the media outlets that follow MMA and sports, they tend to get behind the athletes in a way that's going against the organization. And basically, it's hypocritical because they're doing the exact same thing. They're doing the same thing. They're using these fighters to make headlines, to make advertising dollars, and not paying them a single penny for it. And they're trying to tell them or make it look like the other organizations that are paying them exactly what they signed for or taking advantage of them. So it's very, very hypocritical. And, the media will say, well, we make you look famous, or we make you famous, we make you look good, we do good things. But you know what? It's only if it's headline news. They don't ever come out and do articles on other things. They never come out and do positive articles. How many news articles has there been about Dana being a trailblazer and doing the right thing, and the UFC killing it and having 33 shows during this pandemic? 33 shows they've had. Okay, so if you average 8 fights per show, that's 16 fighters per show times 33. That's 528 times a fighter has been paid in this pandemic for their work, for their fights, for their efforts. Okay. 528 times. Now I get you got guys like Hamza and Kevin Holland. There's been 5 or 6 of those. But either way, 528 times fighters have been paid. The UFC staff has been paid. The UFC company has been paid and is making money and is having supposedly a record year, which is keeping them above water, because if they go under from the pandemic, we all lose, right? 600 fighters lose their jobs. The UFC staff loses their jobs. The parent company that bought the UFC potentially loses its jobs. And we as fans lose the fights. And now the podcasts like mine become non-existent, the ones that depend on the UFC and the major fighters and the major fights. But when I saw this whole thing, when I talked to Dana back in October, and then I finally got to see what he did, I just feel like I had to come out and share my piece on it and just talk about how incredible it was. This is a very incredible thing that he did. This is a 1 out of a 7 billion thing that he did. Nobody stood up and fought this pandemic like he did. No one, not one single person. You're talking about thousands of sporting organizations around the world that could have, one person in any of those sporting organizations could have stepped up and said, you know what, I'm going to do this. None of them did. One man did it. So you got to give him credit for that. I guess my long story short here is hats off to Dana. What a fucking awesome job. What a fucking awesome video to fire back at these guys that have nothing better to do than just to be fucking negative, who never fought in the UFC. They never put their ass on the line and went out there and risked getting knocked out and getting flamed by the media for having a horrible fight. They never trained and did any of this stuff, but they're quick to get on there and try to bring you down and make what you're doing harder. And these same media outlets that were talking all this shit and being negative are employed right now and keeping, being able to report the fucking fights every single weekend because of what Dana did. That's the ironic thing about it. 33 events worth of news coverage that these media outlets that were negative have been able to report on because of what he's done. So just don't fall in the trap of listening to the negativity. It's bullshit. It's all bullshit. And I agree 100% with Dana. You don't need any of it. You don't need any of this shit. And the only people that pay attention to this kind of stuff is the negative, miserable people that want to sit around and listen to other negative, miserable people. And those people will never be successful, ever. They never will be. The successful people that I know are not the ones that sit around and bitch and complain and talk shit about people. They're the people that are working their asses off to figure out solutions to make their businesses and their lives successful. And I want to say one more thing. Hats off to the fighters, because the fighters didn't have to continue to fight this pandemic. They didn't have to be quarantined, get tested multiple times, risk getting COVID and getting sick and having to at least risk training in less than ideal circumstances in their gyms and with their training partners to go fight and make a living for their family. But they did. And that it was worth it for them, and it was their choice. And hats off to them. And I'm saying this because as a media outlet, I will be one to do something like this, because you will never see an article that's focused on the positivity towards the fighters for fighting through this pandemic as well. Not only Dana for saving the jobs and the fights, but for the fighters to actually go to Yas Island for, a week to a month to 2 months at a time, staying in quarantine, being away from their families, having to get tested multiple times, not being able to train as much as they should for a fight, and then getting in there and fighting their asses off. Hats off to you guys. Hats off to you guys for going in there and fucking putting these fights on so that you can take care of your families and keep us entertained as fans while we're sitting in our houses and being miserable, right? Because we can't get out and do things. We can't travel. We can't go to fights anymore. We can't go to live sporting events anymore. You guys are making it a lot easier for us and giving us hope and entertaining us. So since nobody else will do it, I'm going to do it. And I'm going to say thank you all you fighters, every single fighter that stepped in that octagon in the last 33 fights since March. Hats off to you. Hats off to all of you, and you have my respect. And I'm honored to have all of you on my podcast, and it's great interviewing you. It's great to talk about it, and I think that's enough for now. Sorry guys, I ran way too long, but that's just my my piece. So those of you who's never seen me rant about something or have a big opinion, well, there you go. There's mine.